That's a great point. Golf is full of these things, right, that seem like they intuitively should be true, but it's very difficult to establish that they really make a difference. And rate of closure, I'd say, is in that category. It's like it stands to reason that if you have the head more steady through impact, that should be more consistent, right? If it's not rotating as much through the impact zone, you would think I'm going to have better control of my face angle. I mean, it all makes sense, except that when we measure players, we don't see this great trend. You know, there are really good drivers of the ball who have very low rate of closure, but there are really good drivers of the ball who have reasonably high rate of closure. And it doesn't mean there's nothing there, but it means that we may have to dig a little deeper and understand more what's going on. So that's a great question.
The following is a conversation with Dr. Paul Wood. Paul is VP of Engineering at Ping, and he's one of my favourite people to listen to when it comes to golf performance and technology. Paul presents some great data that he's collected on driving and whether it's best to hit curved or straight drives, what the data says. We then move on to some discussion around wedges before talking about what this means for golfers and your performance. Enjoy. Thank you so much. As I said, followed you for a long time. I know you've got some awesome data to present today in terms of sort of driving and wedges. But looking back at your past, and you did a PhD, if I'm right, in solar flares.
It was in solar flares. Yeah, in the math department at St Andrews. A long time ago now.
Yeah, and then you started at Ping in 2005. So I think before we get into this data, because you've got some amazing stuff to show us, what has changed in terms of trying to understand golf performance, impact, from 2005 at Ping to where you are now in this fancy lab?
That's a great question. I think the big thing that's changed is the access to data we have. And, you know, sitting here in 2024, that's maybe as keenly felt as any time, right? Everyone's trying to figure out how is AI going to impact my life. When I started at Ping in 2005 was just when we were really starting to ramp up the amount of data we could capture. You know, we had this brand new device called a Trackman that no one had heard of, right? It was the first time we'd been able to get real, like, data on the entire ball flight because the radar tracks the whole ball flight. And we had the very first one, and I was tasked with, right, go make something useful out of this Trackman data, which was, for a mathematician, so much fun. Well, I mean, Trackmans and GC quads and flight scopes and launch monitors of all kinds are everywhere now, right? Every big company has them. A lot of fitters have them. Most coaches have them. A lot of individuals have them. So our access to data is so much more than we ever had. You know, we use the Arcos system where you can get information about where you've been on the golf course during your round using GPS, right? None of that existed in 2005. So that's the big difference. You know, we've had the mechanical expertise, we've had the materials expertise, manufacturing, but now we have this whole wing of data science and mathematics and statistics, which is really fun to be part of.
Yeah, and actually, I want to that's my question at the end, to sort of ask you about the future and where you think this is all heading. Is, you know, you're in a privileged position, I think, where you are. So, yeah, but if you'd like to sort of get these slides today, so we've got some of your research on driving, which we actually shot a short reel on. So I always follow the Ping blog, and when this came up, I was like, this is a great little thing to share with golfers. But we'll get the full shebang today, which is awesome.
It's a simple question, really, and this is something that working with coaches is very important to them to understand. Is it better to hit a consistent shot shape, or is it okay to just hit it straight, right? And I think conventional wisdom for a long time was pick a shot shape, whether you were more of a draw player or a fade player, and always do that. You know, and then you get some exceptions. You know, Bubba Watson would be a great exception, right? Of every shot's a different visual in his head, and the way he does things is very different and probably quite hard to copy for a lot of golfers, but he's the exception, right? Most golfers have a consistent shot shape. And the question here was not so much, you know, should you shape it both ways, but is it better to hit a consistent draw or a consistent fade, or just to hit it straight? And a lot of golfers and a lot of coaches say, no, the straight ball is kind of the bad one. We don't, you know, because you can miss both ways. And there's a little quote here, I'm just going to read it out, but Jack Nicklaus kind of said that the toughest shot in golf is one that's perfectly straight. It's hard to execute physically because so many things must be right at impact. It's tough strategically. It reduces the target area. So, you know, if you aim at the middle of the fairway and you go left or right, you've only got half a fairway to miss. But if you aim on the left side, you've got the whole fairway to miss. Now, far be it for me to argue with 18-time major winner, but the fairway is the same width either way. So it's more a matter of your perspective than how much real fairway you have to hit or miss, right? If you try to start it down the left, well, if you then pull it a bit, you're in the trees. So you can miss a fairway hitting a draw, fade, or straight. But this, I think, is kind of that. Is it actually more difficult to hit it straight than it is to just hit a consistent shot shape? So here we go. That's the motivation. Is it? And so when we say not straight, we mean a non-zero face to path. So you've got, right, the path, which way is the driver moving, left or right, and then you have the face angle, which way is the face pointing at impact. And when those two things are not aligned, then that's when you get a draw or fade, right? So if that makes sense. So if your club path is going like 5 degrees to the right of the target, well, if the face is also pointing 5 degrees to the right, then the face angle relative to the path is 0. The ball just goes straight right. There's no curve on it. It's when those two numbers are different, right? And so for a player that plays a functional draw, one that starts to the right and curves towards the middle, the path has to be going out to the right and the face is closed to that path, right? So if they're just to kind of get everyone on the same page, that's a functional draw, and then a functional fade is one that starts to the left and curves back to the right. A fade that starts right and keeps going right isn't going to keep you, keep you employed as a professional golfer very long. So my colleague Eric actually did a little Twitter poll. This is a couple of years ago when we first talked about some of this data, and he basically said, I'm curious, here's 4 different kind of face to path numbers. Which do you think would be the best practical driver of the golf ball? And this is what he got. So the first one was, the face is 0, the path is 0. This starts straight and goes straight. The second one would be like a pull fade, a functional fade, one where the path is to the left and the face is a little bit less left. The third would be the push draw. So the path is to the right and the face is a little close to that path. And the last one you would hope would be a 0% is one where it's a pull draw. It starts left and goes further left. So I think that's 12% of people in this poll that didn't quite interpret the data. And I hope no one was suggesting a pull draw is the most functional. But what we got out of it was a real mixed bag. There wasn't, the push draw won, but it was quite messy. It was definitely like, and this is mostly coaches taking this poll, was sort of, I'm not really sure. So it's definitely an unanswered question. And you see a few more players on tour now hitting a pretty straight ball. I know Victor Hovland I've talked to, he hits it pretty straight and he says, I'm not too bothered if it falls a little to the left, falls a little to the right, as long as it's mostly straight. That I don't think is a sentiment shared by all players all the time. And so one question is there some sort of biomechanical advantage? And Sasho McKenzie, who's, I'm sure you're aware of Sasho, he's a PhD in biomechanics and one of the world's leading experts on this. This was his succinct answer. No. And I'll flesh it out a little bit, but basically, if you're hitting a dead straight ball, right, and there's a lot of different ways to hit a dead straight ball, or let's just say, let's start with a draw. You're hitting a draw, right? There's lots of different ways to hit a draw. All that's really required to hit a draw is that when you get to impact, the club is moving out to the right and the face is pointing a little left of it, but there's a million ways to get there. So there's no one biomechanical way to hit a draw. But if I now want to take that draw and make it a straight shot, I can just slightly open the face of the golf club and I can point myself a little bit more to the left. And I've taken that push draw and made it straight. And every single thing about the swing other than that is the same. Now, in real life, for a golfer, that might be more complicated, right? Because it's easy to say, just change one thing. But biomechanically, you've made exactly the same swing, and one was a draw and one was straight, and then you could take it further and make that same biomechanical swing a fade. And so it's a very kind of quick argument, but just to show that biomechanically, there's not a difference between a draw and a fade. There might be differences in how you hit a draw and how you hit a fade, right? The personal piece, but just is there something inherently more biomechanically advantageous about a draw or fade? No. Quick answer.
I think from a coaching perspective, it's interesting how we've come to this because of the Trackman technology. We understand the importance of controlling face. And then we have all of the research that I know you presented before around rate of closure. And again, thinking that rate of closure should be something that maybe predicts how good you are at controlling the face angle. But again, we don't have time to hop into that today, but the research was essentially, no, there isn't. There's rate of closure research, I think from Sasho, maybe yourself as well.
From both of us, yeah. And that's a great point. Golf is full of these things, right, that seem like they intuitively should be true, but it's very difficult to establish that they really make a difference. And rate of closure, I'd say, is in that category. It's like it stands to reason that if you have the head more steady through impact, that should be more consistent, right? If it's not rotating as much through the impact zone, you would think I'm going to have better control of my face angle. I mean, it all makes sense, except that when we measure players, we don't see this great trend. You know, there are really good drivers of the ball who have very low rate of closure, but there are really good drivers of the ball who have reasonably high rate of closure. And it doesn't mean there's nothing there, but it means that we may have to dig a little deeper and understand more what's going on. So that's a great question.
Yeah,
you know, I'm still personally interested in rate of closure. If I had to hand on heart, I'd say I probably prefer to be on the lower end because it just makes more sense. But I've seen world-class drivers of the ball who have a high rate of closure.
Yeah, and I think the way I think of this from, say, a motor control perspective is that it's a bit like square-to-square putting. With as much as the way the putter can move looks more simple, the joint mechanics are actually way more complex to make that reproduce. And
100%.
Yeah, and I think it could be a similar thing, maybe not exactly the same, when we look at rate of closure. And it's almost like, well, what forces do the body have to kind of produce and resist to do that? And maybe that's why we get a little bit of muddiness.
I think so. And you just brought up another one that's like, it makes all the sense in the world that if you're trying to hit a putt, and all you need to do is get the face angle square at impact, just keep it square through the whole stroke and it'll be great. Sounds great, but nobody does it. So this is where it gets into a bit of data, and I can whiz through it. But basically, so the hypothesis, is it actually just fundamentally more difficult to have a square face to the path, right? The hypothesis would be that somehow the difficulty goes up when you get near zero. And that's Jack Nicklaus's quote kind of refers to that. So basically, and again, very quickly, the answer is not really. This is a whole bunch of very good golfers who mostly hit a draw, but everything from like a straight ball where the shot bend is just how many yards did it curve in the air. So zero means it was dead straight. So you can see like a little clump of three golfers who are all like right on zero shot bend. Then there's a bunch of golfers, everything from a little tiny bit of fade, which would be a positive number, to like a huge draw, like 40 yards of draw. And then the other axis is the variability. And these are all four-level golfers.
See.
And this is a perfect example of like no correlation. Like you don't need to be a statistician to look at a graph like this and go, oh, okay, you can have a really good face to path and be drawing it a ton. You can have a really good face to path and hit it dead straight, and vice versa. You can be all over the shop. So it's just, this is a random scatter, and it just shows we have not been able to see in our data that in any way, it's just fundamentally more consistent in terms of how you deliver the club. So then the question is there something more consistent in the results? And I'm going to whiz through the impulse momentum modeling slide, because just trust that an impulse momentum model is a very good way to model the impact. It's basically applying, most people will have heard of the conservation of momentum, right? And so basically what we're doing in a model is using all the properties of the club and the ball, using the data we have on how the club is delivered to the ball, and then we can model it and run these what-if studies. So you don't need to understand how an impulse momentum model works. But we feed it real data, and that's the point. So what we can do is look at what real players do, and this is an example of a scratch player and a tour player and how variable their face-to-path is. So these would be two players who are trying to hit it straight, they're trying to be around zero, and even the best players on the planet are kind of plus minus a couple of degrees, like to encapsulate all their shots. You know, that's so that's the variation that even a really good player brings in. If you want to see my scatter, it's going to be a lot wider than that, right? And a beginner is going to be a lot wider again. But this is even really good players centering themselves around, say, zero. That's the scatter. So we feed that into the model. You're probably getting more data than you need here, but right, just to show you how much goes into this. And then we feed all that into a ball flight model, right? And again, one of my first projects, Ping, was building a ball flight model. How golf balls fly is pretty complex stuff, but once you have a model, you can factor out things like wind and temperature differences and just the subtle variations of balls. And so we feed all this into the model, and we start to generate these ball flights, and then we start to look at, this is just an example of, you know, the consistency of like where the ball lands as a function now of face to path. And so we'll get to the kind of headline here, which is, all right, here we go. When I have an extreme draw, and the same would apply on a fade side. So the face to path is 6 degrees close, and I want to compare that to dead straight. And we model out 100 shots. The shaped shots are going like 20 yards shorter than the straight shots. And the reason for that is, like, you know, this is assuming that we're reasonably optimized. You've been fit for your driver and you're not hitting it super high or super low, whatever. You know, basically you can think of it, you're putting a bunch of energy into making that ball curve left to right. That energy could have been going towards hitting the ball straight. And so you're giving up like 20 yards if you hit a really big draw fade.
Yeah, and
that's what it looks like.
So I was going to say, that's both in terms of the energy transfer from the club to the ball, and then also the distance of the ball flight has to essentially be longer to get the same distance. You've got like a double whammy there. Exactly.
And so that's what you see. So you can see, though, that the extreme misses like on the left-right aren't as big as the extreme misses left-right on the straight shots. You know, but you probably guess that's nowhere near enough to be a kind of net positive to your golf game. And you can sort of do it in terms of, you know, the dispersion is 12% smaller, good. The loss of distance is 24 yards, terrible. The strokes gained per round, like the overall, is that better for your game or worse? It's the hitting it straight is way better, right? So that's a drive versus a really big draw. If we aimed at 4 degrees close to path, which I'd say is a pretty big draw, you can see on the top right, that's still a pretty good curve. Like things get a little tighter. Now the difference in distance is 11 yards, that's still, you know, for most players, that's a club into the green. That's a decent amount. The dispersion's a bit smaller, but the strokes gained per round is still much better for the straight shot. Now, obviously, for you as an individual, this could be different for each person, depending on how far they hit it to start with and how wild they are to start with. But this is sort of for the average elite player, because we're trying to answer the question here more for the elite player. And the last one, when you get down to 2 degrees, and this is what I would call like a baby draw, right? Where actually on the miss pattern now, the odd one goes kind of straight. So this is sort of, it's enough to still be a real draw, but it's a pretty subtle one. And this is more in the range of what a lot of players on tour are doing now, or baby fade. Now, actually, it's pretty much a wash. There's a tiny bit of difference in distance. It's 3 yards on here, but you can see there's more overlap in the scatter. The dispersion's a tiny bit smaller. The strokes gain technically is a little better still for the straight, but it's only 0.1 strokes around. And this is where you get to the point where us as mathematicians go, okay, pick whichever one you like. These are both good enough, right? And if you want to play a draw or a fade, that's cool. Just don't play a huge draw or fade, because you'd be giving up a ton of distance. But once you get to this level, you're fine. And the last bit on the topic, go on.
No, I was going to say, if you got one more, because I was really interested in, say, what's the mechanism behind the dispersion going down?
It's
is that tricky to say because the model's quite black boxy, and
it's tricky to say. Well, I mean, I understand the model hopefully as well as anyone because I helped build it, but it's tricky to answer without getting very technical. But I think basically like a little bit of so spin acts as a little bit of a rudder to the golf ball and kind of keeps it flying more consistently. So in general, if you have like someone who's on the very low spin side versus someone who's on the very high spin side, the high spin player, the ball will stay a little straighter and deviate offline as much. The cost usually is like a lot of spin, you're giving up distance, you know, whether that's on your irons or your driver. But there's this trade-off of like, spin can be a good thing. It's just when the spin gets excessive, you can be costing yourself distance. So yeah, it's a little bit of that rudder effect that you get of some of the spin. But
I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
One of the reasons I saw this research, and I'm all right understanding biomechanics, but I'm not as bright as you. And I was like, I want to hear what it is, because it's not significant, as you say. It's not something every golfer should go chase, but it's still very interesting to understand these aspects.
I spent a long time in the weeds on this. The last slide is really just so what about the human? And when we presented this at a coach's camp, one of the guys who kind of stood up and said, okay, well, I want to provide my perspective was Grant Waite. And if you've not come across Grant, he's a great coach and a great player, and he's been coaching and playing for a long time. He plays some Champions Tour these days. So he's that good mix of someone who's thinking deeply about his own game as a tour player, and he's thinking about the coach's side. And his argument, which really struck home for me, was here. So the thing is, if you're wanting to see the ball curve a little right to left, and you look up and it's curving right to left, you at least feel like it's got a chance the whole way down the flight. You know, even if at the end of the day, if you undercurve it or overcurve it and it misses, you still at least feel like it's got a chance the whole way. If you look up and you see that ball starting and it's going left or right, it's going the wrong way from the start, it's so disheartening because you know from the start that it's like it's gone. And he said he thinks that's the real essence of, like, if you at least have a window that you're trying to hit, there's just, you're kind of more in the game. You can stay in it, you can stop being disheartened for longer. Whereas if you're kind of not sure, it could start left, it could start right, it can be very disheartening very quickly to a good golfer. And so his view was that just having a consistent shape really helps psychologically, which I think is very, very possible. And that's where it would come down to, we would recommend you go for it, but just don't play 30 yards of draw, play 10 yards of draw or something, and you won't be giving up a ton of distance. So and golf comes back to the human, right? There's a bunch of the physics, there's a bunch of the biomechanics that we have to get right, or at least get good enough. And then there's the human piece that you can't forget. And so in this case, I think this debate about can you hit a straight shot comes down much more to the human. Are you okay seeing it fall a bit to the left, fall a bit to the right, or do you need to see it going the same way each time?
I think that's what becomes, it's really good to see. And again, it gets back to what you can do consistently, doesn't it? In terms of human movement, and what can you repeat in terms of that face path relationship that gets it somewhere near the target.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the question here, which I think would be interesting to people, is it possible to hit up on a wedge shot? Right? We talk about hitting up on our driver. That wasn't really a big thing 20 years ago, or at least it wasn't talked about a ton. But now a lot of people have been exposed to the fact that, hitting up a little bit on the driver can be good for getting kind of the optimized launch conditions. That's not what we're talking about on wedges typically. But there was a specific kind of shot that Chris Como is a very good coach, or one of the very best coaches in the world, who's a brand ambassador of ours. He came to us a few years ago and said, hey, when you hear Phil Mickelson talk about hitting this high spinning wedge shot, he talks about using the ground and actually bouncing the club up into the ball. And so is it possible to measure that? And our answer at the time was, it's really tricky, because you're talking about, if people can see my hands, but you're talking about an area a couple of inches either side of the golf ball. And everything that's happening in that couple of inches is happening in a few thousandths of a second, right? Not even hundredths of a second, but thousandths of a second. And if the ground is interacting with the club and the ball at the same time, that's all happening really, really fast. So the quick version is, we didn't really have a great way to measure that. It's a really tricky thing for any of the launch monitors to measure. You tend to be able to fit a swing onto this nice curve, and then the curve starts to break down when you slam it into the ground. So recently, we did a study. I mean, if people can see this video, this is kind of a little bit, what we're talking about. This is using high-speed cameras to look at this kind of high spinning shot. And what you want for that high spinning shot is it needs to be a very clean contact, because any grass or water will reduce the spin a ton. But you need to deliver quite a lot of loft to the ball to get it going high. And the question is, and Phil was saying, it feels like the club's actually going up into the ball. And so this is what I'm talking about. It's not, when you hit the ground, your arc is suddenly not a smooth arc. So, as a mathematician, we like to draw these nice curves. And for the most part in a golf swing, you can draw nice curves. And then as soon as you hit the ground, you're messing with that curve. And then the club hits the ball, and that's messing with that curve again. So you get this funky wiggle, right? And that, what you can see on the chart, that's just the path of the middle of the club face. It's getting bounced up by the ground, and then it gets bounced down by the ball, and then it kind of resumes its merry way. And so, to cut a long story short, in our focus system, which is our high-speed camera system, we've added some stuff to really focus on that. And we measured a bunch of tour players, and then we measured 150 golfers. And I'll get to the punchline, so we have a little bit of time for questions. we basically had players, and this is kind of what we do with folk. You can see Victor hitting some pitches. We had players hitting 50-yard, 30-yard, and then 60-yard pitches. And we're using motion capture for high-speed cameras to measure the club and specifically looking at exactly what's going on around the ground. And we wanted to know, do we see some positive angle attacks, like at the ball? And in 4,000 swings, these are two different handicap groups, the 2 and better and the 3 to 9. We also had, a higher handicap group, but wanted to show this for like pretty good players. This is 4,000 shots. All of these, everything to the right, those red, we measured actually positive angle attacks at the ball. So we went from like, can we measure one shot with a positive angle attack to, hold on a second, I think there's like 1,000 here. And the reality, what we saw is that you can measure exactly where is the club moving when it hits the ground. And most players hit the ground a tiny bit before the ball, which makes sense. You got to get that club under the ball. 86% of every shot we measured had some level of club hitting ground before ball, which it doesn't make it a bad shot. In fact, that's what most golfers do most of the time. And a well-struck shot involves a little bit of turf interaction. But the more you hit the ground before the ball, the more it's bending your attack angle upwards. So your nice, neat, 7 or 8 degree down pitch, if you catch it a little fat, suddenly becomes like 5 degrees up on the ball. And that's a hugely different ball flight. And I think a take-home message for most sort of regular golfers out there is when you get these kind of shots that come out with like no spin, and you're kind of like, I don't know, it felt like an okay swing. I don't know what happened there. I think this is what's going on. Like, you don't need to catch it too fat, and particularly on harder ground, where suddenly like all of you are like down coming into the ball now is suddenly a bit up. These are on the right here, this group of handicap 3 to 9, these are decent golfers, and look how many shots are actually coming up into the ball.
Yeah, that's
this is hitting off a mat, not a super hard mat, but this is off a mat. And so you get obviously different results depending on whether you're in fluffy rough or wet turf, or you're playing in St Andrews where you're likely to get much more of this, right? Somewhere where it's really hard to bounce, the club bounces. I know that from experience. But I think, there's a lot more in here, and there's a lot more we could go on for 20 minutes about this. But we were quantifying here, like, where are you catching the ground before the ball? Like, just the first point where you catch the ground. And for the vast majority of shots, it's between, like, the ball and about 2 inches behind the ball. And actually, that's a pretty good zone. Like, I remember doing the test myself, and, like, those are the ones where you say, I clipped that pretty well. But you actually caught the ground maybe an inch behind the ball, and that's a good shot. But as soon as that becomes, like, 2.5, 3, 4, 5 inches, that's when, like, suddenly you're losing all of your down and it's going up into the ball. But fascinating for us, particularly with these like 15-yard chips, and it kind of makes sense that when the club's moving pretty slowly, the ground will bounce it right back up really fast. If it's a full swing wedge or a full swing iron, you've got enough momentum to kind of force the club through the ground more. But on these little pitches, if you're not reasonably precise about catching ball, if not first, then close to first, the ground is going to bounce that club in.
Yeah, it's great to see, and it highlights the importance of having good wedges, I suppose, just to wrap it all back in and get some fitting.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And so, back to the question about Phil Mickelson, it's very plausible that he is using the ground and getting a positive angle attack. Right, most of these shots we're measuring were more accidental rather than deliberate.
Amazing. I was just interested, just 2 more questions just to wrap up before you have to head your next meeting. So, number 1. What does this mean to you when we look at the coaching debate around angle of attack and steepness versus shallow and use the bounce?
Yeah, and I have good friends who are world-class wedge coaches on both sides of this debate, so it's an interesting position to be in. We haven't really had the ability to measure this stuff really well before. It's really tricky, and I know from my colleagues at the launch monitor companies, they're now, because we're all looking at this, they're looking at it more too, and we're all going to get better data in the next couple of years. I think up until now, it's been kind of tricky. It's been a lot like, well, that looks steep or that looks shallow, and here's what happened. Now we can really get in and measure it better. I think we can answer some questions. I still go back to and there's a chart later in the presentation that there are world-class chippers who are pretty steep, and there are world-class chippers who are pretty shallow. Just like with everything else in golf, there's a number of ways to get it done. Why a certain technique suits one player and not another, I think, is something that coaches are starting to work out. And obviously, coaches have their preferences, and that's a complicated stuff. But what we would see is you can be a world-class chipper and be steep or shallow. We're just starting to now understand, how does that play into getting you the best wedge to go with your technique, or all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's really nice to hear, because I think from my own coaching perspective, as we know, it's really complicated. But I kind of see the steep camp looking at how we optimize ball first contact, and with this looking at getting close to the ball if we do come in as close as possible to the ball. Whereas we've got the other camp, which is essentially looking at how we use the bounce to allow for ground impact before. So they're kind of on trying to optimize for two different things. And yeah, I don't have any huge preference. It's really interesting to follow, and look forward to the research that you have coming out in the future. So look, Paul, I know you've got another meeting to get to, so I want to say thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate your time with that. Just final thing, where do you think golf performance is going in the future? Have you got anything sort of lined up that you're looking at next that we can look forward to?
I mean, we've still got a bunch. There's a lot more unanswered questions out in golf. I think the questions get deeper and more sophisticated, but our ability to get the right data to answer them gets deeper and more sophisticated. So it's this kind of really fun interplay. And I just think that's going to continue. I think a huge one is linking what we can measure in the lab with what goes on the course, right? I think everyone would have a pretty good understanding that exactly how you swing on the course is a little different to your range swing, and quantifying that and understanding more about how that works. We have these tools to measure where you go on the course and what you're doing and where your misses are, and then linking that back to just your fundamental technique. Those are things I'm really interested to dive into. Those are places where like AI tools, for example, could be really helpful to us, like sifting through really big data and looking for some highlights that we can then dive into and answer more questions. So our team continues to grow, and I don't see us running out of things to study for a while yet.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Paul. Appreciate it.
Thanks.